The 25th of January, 1998. I remember waking with a jolt to a thundering noise. A suicide bombing. A truck laden with high-intensity explosives had rammed into the Temple of the Truth relic, which is one of Sri Lanka's most sacred sites. Luckily for me, I was a mile away at my home, and no one close to me was affected. And it was just one occurrence for me. But for the better part of 30 years, Sri Lanka was ravaged by a brutal civil war. In the north and east, the war front, devastation and loss of life was everywhere. In the south and western parts, intermittent suicide bombings drew a terrible fear psychosis. That was the sad reality of Sri Lanka. However, in 2009, the war came to an end with a military victory over the rebels. About a year and a half later, I was studying policy in the plush classrooms of an American university. They were discussing, and I was participating, in the theoretical realms of policy. What needs to be done, who said what, this is theory. But what I realized there was that even having come from Sri Lanka, I had little understanding of what the ground realities were in my own country. What the people who had been directly affected by the war, what were they going through? What were the post-conflict efforts like? I did not understand the practicalities of the situation, a big shortcoming on my part. And because of that very reason, I decided to go back and work for the Bureau of the Commissioner General of Rehabilitation, which is a government body that was tasked with rehabilitating and reintegrating into society ex-rebels. So there I was, a 21-year-old young college student, very idealistic in certain ways, trying to understand all the complexities of my own country and the conflict in Sri Lanka. I was in a bus going to a town called Vaunia, which is a border town, and I lived for 4 months in a rehabilitation camp. It was a 3-storied old school that they had converted. It was hot, it was dusty, and I lived in the same conditions as those who were undergoing a rehabilitation process. There, I was amidst 2 groups of people that were very important to me. On the one hand, were the beneficiaries. Now, the beneficiaries was a term given to ex-LTTE cadre by the government. They didn't want to call them ex-rebels or ex-terrorists because at one time it was a proscribed terrorist group. They wanted to remove all of those negative connotations and use the term beneficiary, which I think was a very human thing to do. On the other hand, because the North was still heavily militarized, there was a heavy presence of soldiers. So I got to interact with soldiers as well. So these 2 groups of people were the people who had faced the utmost of the Sri Lankan conflict. For me, they had undergone tremendous amounts of pain, misery, and through the conflict. They were the face of Sri Lanka's war. My role there was twofold. On the one hand, I was to look at the on-the-ground realities, understand the rehabilitation program, and then offer strategy recommendations and policy recommendations to the then advisor to the president on reconciliation and rehabilitation. That was my main role, because I wanted to understand what was going on. And secondly, because I also had spare time living all of that time there, I assisted in their academics. Some of them hadn't had the chance to sit for their school leaving examination, and now, many years later, were looking at resitting that exam. So I helped out with that process as well. So before I go on further, I'd like to ask from all of you, who here, with a raise of hands, who here has ever interacted with an ex-combatant or a soldier? Someone who has held arms. Great. Who here, out of those who raised your hands, has had an extensive discussion, a heart-to-heart conversation, and created a bond with that person? Wonderful. I'd like to talk about 3 people. First of all, a guy called Thiru. He was my translator when I was up there and helped me with some of the language. 3 weeks into my stay, he comes up to me and says, "Hey, can I talk to you?" Of course, in the local dialect. I was like, "Of course, sit down. Let's have a chat." And he's like, "When you first came, we didn't trust you. We were skeptical as to why you were here." And then they had asked the officers as to what I was doing. And they had said, "No, he's here to understand what's going on, how to make this program better, and understand, what you really feel about these programs." And then he also said, "Every day you come and teach us, and you be with us, you try to talk to us, and you spend so much of time, that coupled with what you're doing has now made me trust you. That I now trust you." That was a very important thing for me to hear. The word trust, that someone can trust me. And this is something that is very important for building peace. From there on, the discussion was much more open. He opened up to me, he talked to me about his childhood, all the troubles he had undergone as a kid during the war, how he and his best friend joined the LTTE, how his best friend actually died in combat right in front of him. But that was the past. He was also talking about the future, how he wants to leave, he was talking about this girl that he had met a while back, that he was still in love with. He would talk about all of her characteristics. For me, a young 21-year-old college student who was also in pursuit of love, that was a connect. That was a very human connect. And we became really close friends. He was a hopeless romantic, but he was in search of happiness. The second person is a guy called Samare for short. He was a soldier as well who was working on the rehabilitation program. And he would chime in and participate in the discussions that me and Thiru were having. He would talk about his family, and he would urge Thiru, "Yeah, you should go and settle down," And he would talk about how he missed his family when he was a soldier fighting the war, because he would be deployed for 1 month, 2 months at end, and even more without seeing his family. And they talked about the search for love and what it meant to be in a family. That's what they strived for. And the third person I'd like to talk to you about is a guy called Nayan. He was not a hopeless romantic. He was an entrepreneur. The love of his life was not a girl or a guy, but cars and bikes. He wanted to leave, after leaving the rehabilitation center, what he wanted to do was establish a mechanical workshop to repair and modify cars and bikes. He was an entrepreneur. And he was very excited about it. You could see it in his eyes. But there was also fear. As an ex-combatant, he feared that he might not have the opportunities, the means, the support to go and do that. And that was quite disheartening for me, to see that people are afraid to realize their dreams, especially in the economic context. And so later on, I would go and help out with that process, me and a few friends, and help develop some of the SMEs in those areas. Talking to these people and countless others made me understand their reality to a greater extent. And through that understanding, it grew a sense of empathy within me. But what is empathy? It's a word that's very frequently used. For me, empathy means the innermost reaction in your inner core that says to you, you need to do something to help affect or make better that person's life. You need to reach that point. So earlier I asked for a show of hands. There were a number of you who did, but it wasn't even close to half of the audience. And that in itself is a gap. All of you are here today because you believe in sustainable peace. But to achieve sustainable peace in different regions or different contexts or globally, we need to understand the realities on the ground. We need to be with the people and in those respective regions. And that is the role of both local and international stakeholders. What bothered me the most when I was in Vaunia was that during that entire time, there was only one politician who came and had an honest dialogue with those combatants or soldiers. How then are we going to affect sustainable peace? The question is, how much time and energy do key stakeholders invest in actually achieving and understanding the realities on the ground? Like Sven mentioned, understanding what they need is key. If you don't know that, then you're lost. For me, peace building is not something that needs to be done in opulent galleries and lavish state houses. It's something that's done on the ground with the people in dusty corridors, and maybe with AK-47s around. That's the reality. So, if you want more sustainable peace, we need to affect and influence the lives of those people who are affected by conflict the most. We need to be there with them. We need to invest significant time and energy. We cannot dictate from away. We need to be there, be present. We need to listen with our hearts. We need to understand with our minds. And then we need to rationalize with all of our intellect and offer solutions for sustainable peace. All of you here, you're probably here because you have a good heart. You want to see peace in this world. And I urge you to go out there, if you're interested in a conflict, if you want to affect change, be there. Understand those realities, understand the people, build those bonds. Because the most powerful and the most sustainable types of peace is a peace that's achieved by the people, for the people. Thank you.